Thank you. Greetings, everyone. I got a lot of questions about my socks earlier, and I'm wearing them because they were my holiday present from Margaret Lowe. I just want to confess that, so thank you, Margaret.
You look like President Bush.
Exactly. Well, I want to thank. So now we're here to talk about the role of regulation, the role of government. You know, earlier in the first panel, I asked some of the panelists who the bad guys were in the pricing world and figuring out how to get this right. And I don't want to point fingers here, but here we have the person responsible for the Medicare payment system, the hospitals. We have a former commissioner of the FDA, and we have someone who's been a really, really wonderful patient rights advocate. So maybe you two are the ones that
we'll take full
are responsible.
responsibility.
Yeah, no. But Andy, let me start for you with a minute on this broad question of the role of regulation, because I know when you were at the FDA, you were a huge advocate for reforming critical paths, trying to find different things. And I guess, you know, as someone who's a closet libertarian, I always ask myself when we talk about regulation, do we really need regulation? So what is your answer to that, having come out of the GOP world and I think kind of roll back the regulatory? What's the right equilibrium when it comes to the public interest in getting the drug pricing world right?
Well, we need good regulation.
And who determines that?
Well, what determines that is how successful it is in being able to accelerate our ability to bring new products, life-saving products, to patients, while at the same time assuring that they're going to be safe.
Do you think the system is broken today?
No, I think the system is in need of modernization, and it needs to continue to respond to the enormous changes that are occurring around us in science and in technology, in the world of globalization. And regulatory capacity and regulatory policy needs to keep pace with those changes. So it has served us extraordinarily well. And the Food and Drug Administration has been the world's gold standard for over 100 years. But it needs to evolve just as the world's evolving. So there is the need for us to re-examine policy and to modify it and change it as we need.
Jerry, I'm going to jump to Jerry for a second because you're also part of the sculpting the public policy or the public architecture in Medicare and thinking about these. If you were to do what you did in the 80s and 90s today and reform the system, what would you do? What would be some of the big lift items you would take on?
So I think the biggest one is if you think about the Medicare DRG system, it is essentially a bundled payment system where we took all the services that the hospitals provided and put them into one single payment. And what we're seeing now is we're bundling more and more services together, hospitals, physicians, home health services into bundled payments for knees and for hips. But what's not included in these bundled payments are typically pharmaceuticals. And I think the idea of putting pharmaceuticals into a bundled payment is something whose time has come.
Do pharmaceuticals want to be bundled?
Well, I don't know about the drugs themselves, but the companies are essentially interested in this concept. I mean, we hear about value-based pricing, and the question is, who should determine the value? And there's really a number of choices. You could have the PBMs or the PDPs making the choices, and they're making a lot of the choices today about value. But I actually have much more confidence in the physician and the patient making those choices. So in a bundled payment world, the choice of which drug to use would go to the physician or to the hospital as opposed to the PDP or PBM. And for me, that's just a better decision point. I want my doctor deciding which drug I get, not my PDP.
Amy, I'm interested in how you see the sort of the pricing life of drugs. I know you're at the Food and Drug Law Institute, and you're not an advocacy position, but you've got a good purview, a good perch looking at this. And you know, there have been some of the issues that have come up are high launch prices for drugs. You know, patent terms and patent protections, and where those ought to be done. The generic backlog, if you will. And again, you know, so that this morning can be consequential, I'm sort of interested in people who would say, how would you shift it? What needs to change to actually get to a healthier pricing system than we have today, if you agree that it's problematic today?
Well, I'm going to start with, I think one of the problems is it's so complicated, and there
Quoting
is...
Donald Trump.
Yeah, who knew it was so complicated? Yeah. But It's interesting because the simple answer is the FDA, as we've discussed already this morning, does not regulate the price of drugs. But there are so many regulations and laws that significantly impact the price of drugs, that you really need to look at the totality of it. And all those regulations have a goal or a purpose that is not is not pricing. But so you have to balance, though, and still look at the purpose of those regs. For example, the generic drug system. Let's face it, drug pricing competition has a lot to do with drug pricing. And so the backlog and the time it takes for generics to get through. Should we prioritize that is one question. The issue about how much communication industry can have with payers in terms of marketing, which I know was discussed at the prior panel. There are limitations for safety reasons on what pharmaceutical companies can communicate. But just quick, there's a lot of issues right now on communications on off-label use, but the latest number I've heard is 40% of prescriptions are off-label. So providers sometimes are limited, as well as payers, in getting information on off-label use.
So on that, I just want to, on that communications issue, it seems to me that is a very hard issue for the public to weigh in one way or another. And one of the interesting things that I worry about when I hear about equations like this is the nanny state challenge, right? Is there so much concern that what becomes the oversight, the corrective to wanting to regulate everything or to preempt that? And if the concern is so-called safety, I tell you, on the same stage, we've had a lot of conversations in here with various parts of the healthcare system, more on the use of data when it comes to HIPAA. And you can look at those groups in HIPAA on information sharing and control, and you can either make the case that they're trying to preserve their incumbent place in business as opposed to the public benefits that might come from more sharing. You can be on either side, but I'm interested in who makes the other side on the information case, that if there was more communication on pricing early on with payers and efficacy of the drugs, right?
Well,
and part of
yeah.
it, if you're going to get a value-based system, you have to know what's happening,
It's
right?
not just communication on pricing, it's communication on data that the manufacturer may have about the value of the drug beyond what the label approves it for. But there's a real spectrum here. I come from a general principle that better decisions are made when you have more information. I mean, that's pretty simplistic. But communication, there's a full spectrum. There's direct-to-consumer advertising. Do we actually want manufacturers to be able to advertise for a use that isn't approved by FDA? No. I think most people agree on that. And then there's data, clinical trial data given to payers so that they can make better decisions. They're all different scenarios which you have to balance the benefit from the risk.
Andy, I saw you object.
Yeah, well, I think for me, I would like to step back for a second because maybe not in this forum, but in many places where this conversation's occurring, there's tremendous confusion between price and cost, and those terms get used interchangeably. And I think we need to really draw a bright line between price and cost as it relates to the FDA. In my opinion, the FDA should have no role whatsoever in determining the price of a drug or any medical product. However, the FDA does and can play an important role in influencing the cost that goes into those drugs. So
can we make this real for people? And let's use the example of EpiPen.
Well, let's make it real from the point of view of following up on Amy's point. And that is, if one looks at drug development across its entire spectrum, there are a number of places along that road where the FDA can intervene with appropriate regulatory policy that can reduce the cost. A simple example to bring it home, if you look at the 21st Century Cures Act enabling the FDA to use biomarkers more in the regulatory decision-making process, which could reduce the risk of failure, et cetera, that translates into cost reduction for the developer. And Jerry and I were talking, and I'd like him to chime in, is could you then, if you reduced cost by regulatory policy,
by greater certainty on the research side.
By an acceleration of bringing it to market with greater patent protection. There are many things we could talk about. But then the question is, can you link that to the reduction in price? And Jerry has some...
So typically you can't. I mean, the drug companies absolutely need a huge amount of money to do R&D. but at the same time, they don't typically price a specific drug based upon the amount of R&D that they invested in that particular drug. So, I think there is a relationship, but it's at the corporate level, it's not at the individual drug level in terms of pricing. In terms of a slightly bigger issue, if you wanted to step back, is who's responsible in the federal government for this whole issue of drug pricing? I mean, the FDA has a small role and doesn't really want one. CMS has a role, but has given a lot of it to the PDPs. You have the VA with a significant role. You have DOD, the Public Health Service. There isn't anyone in the federal government whose responsibility is it to worry about the prices for drugs, either just that the federal government buys, maybe what the Medicaid program buys, and not the consumer buy. So if I was Donald Trump or somebody and I was saying, who's responsible in the federal government for drug pricing, I don't know where I would turn. And I think that's a serious problem.
Fascinating circle. Amy, we were talking a little bit about patents as well, and I know there's been a lot of talk about whether or not the current patent terms that are provided, which I think are 12 years, whether those are too long and need to be brought down in order to create more pathways for earlier generics, I guess, to bring down prices. Is that a healthy way to look at this? And I was also intrigued with Gail Walensky's comment earlier, which, coming from someone who was an avowed Republican, I was surprised by, because she was basically advocating a picking winners and losers kind of approach to that. If there is a monopolist out there that's misbehaving, that the government could in fact come in and weigh in and actually pump up the rival, which sounded fascinating to me, and no one reacted, I think, as much as I'd be surprised by. But Andy, let's start with Amy.
Yeah.
And then Andy.
Well, I think you really, again, with regulation and law, lumping them
Right.
together, you have to figure out what's your goal. And the goal of exclusivity is to promote innovation, to
Right.
incentivize the companies to do the R&D in the tough areas.
So is
let's
12
face
years
it.
right?
It depends. You get a guaranteed, for an orphan drug, and for under Hatch-Waxman, you get a guaranteed period of exclusivity. And that, in theory, as far, it seems to incentivize companies. So I'm not sure shortening it is what you want to do, but the monopoly does, and the lack of regulation does allow the price to go higher. And really is, what is it we want to control? There's about 40 moving parts at least here, and we do have to prioritize. And to
Andy,
me, actually,
yeah.
sorry, Andy,
So where would the
as a
government
former
push on
patient
those 40
advocate,
points?
you don't want to disincentivize innovation.
So I'll give you a real-world example of the point that you were raising with Gail Walensky. Back in 2006, when we were faced with bird flu, H5N1, we only had 2 licensed vaccine manufacturers in the country. In order to create capacity, FDA took a very proactive stance of going out, engaging with companies, and helping them to be able to meet good manufacturing practices, et cetera, so that they would be able to come back into the manufacturing of vaccines. So it wasn't necessarily going out and paying somebody to create an alternative to the monopoly. It was nurturing the ability for companies to come in and engage by helping them adapt to the regulatory requirements that were going to be necessary. And then we wound up with 5 companies, as I recall, and that translated into us being able to really meet needs for seasonal influenza. So my point is, FDA, as a regulator, can play an extremely important role in facilitating the ability for companies to participate in the marketplace, and that then translates into more competition and lower prices.
Jerry, does that work for you?
Well,
I mean, you've said that if we did value-based pricing with water, no one could afford water and lots of people would die because
Right.
the value is so high. I mean, I'm intrigued by that comment. It's sort of haunting me right now as I was drinking water in the other room.
Exactly. Well,
So happy I don't have-
So if you paid it on the basis of value, we're mostly
And it may sound
water.
absurd.
We couldn't exist without.
It may sound absurd to people, but the natural logic to your logic is, would you then organize the healthcare industry as you would a utility?
So to go to your question about patents and all those issues, I mean, if you look at the history of patent law, it was from 1790 that essentially was one of the first laws that Congress passed was patent law, and it was set for the length of 2 indentured servants. And that's essentially what we have now, slightly modified. So it has nothing to do with the length has nothing to do with pharmaceuticals. Microsoft, everybody has the same essential patent law. And then we have some additional market exclusivity periods in the program. If you do it from an economist's point of view, it makes absolutely no sense because somebody like Gilead has made so much money on it in the first 2 or 3 years that they didn't actually develop the drug; they essentially purchased the drug. So that doesn't make a lot of sense from an economist's point of view. But if you take a broader view of the system, it does make sense because you've got to give them some idea of how long are they going to have a time period for exclusivity? And if you tailor to each product whatever, no one would know how long they would have to have a market exclusivity period. So some regularity is important, but from an economist's point of view, if you just want to incentivize somebody, you essentially say, as Gail Walensky would do, or somebody, give them 3 times their investment or some number like that, and that would be a sufficient incentive. But that would just be so hard to implement.
But then it's even hard to pinpoint what the investment is. Is it the investment in that drug, or what about the failed drugs?
No, you'd have to do it on all of the drugs, but nevertheless, it would still be a very hard thing to do. So,
do you guys think in this climate, I hate to go back to the debate over the Affordable Care Act and others, but for those of us that are lay people outside looking at it, it does look like a complete mess. It does look like if the Atlantic were a hospital or a healthcare provider or an insurer, I mean, it would be a really convulsive environment in which to sort of look at. And I'm interested in those, I mean, you've all been involved with this a long time. What do your crystal balls say to you when you see the trends now and how to get some of these issues right? Do you think it's possible to get any of this right and in a healthier place in this environment? Amy?
I think we have to. I think there's been a
But
fair
there's
amount.
have to and will or likely to or
well,
probabilities.
the way what we've all been talking about up here is that it's many moving parts. And I think there will be efforts to tweak and improve some of the different moving parts. I don't know that there will be a holistic approach. And I don't think there's will or ability right now for that. But I think there will be movement. And I think one piece I mentioned earlier, off-label use, there's a lot of litigation going on right now on First Amendment rights that corporations have to communicate truthful and non-misleading information about their products. And that the courts may influence this a little bit too. Again, it's only 1 or 2 of the many moving parts.
So I think there are 2 areas which we really got to focus on. One is generic drugs where there's no competition or maybe one competitor. And what are we going to do in those cases? I mean, we're all aware of the Daraprims and all those situations. Maryland just passed legislation last week essentially talking about price gouging and essentially said unconscionable price increases are subject to civil money penalties. So that's an area that we've got to take a look at, is the whole issue of generic drugs, and take a look at the FTC's role in this and a whole variety of other things. And I've been testifying in Congress about limited distribution networks or limited distribution chains where the drug companies keep another drug company from getting access to the drug so they can't demonstrate bioequivalence. The other area is the whole issue of the specialty drugs, which are so expensive. And here I think it's going to come down to an area of access. The Senate Finance Committee did a study looking at the sort of the model that Gilead had for Hep C drugs, and they decided that Gilead decided that only about 15 to 20% of the population that gets access should get access to this drug according to their
15 to 20% of the population that needs it?
That needs it. And this is a drug that is essentially almost a complete cure for an infectious disease. But the pricing model that Gilead operates said 15 to 20% is our profit maximizing point. So we're going to have to, as policymakers, come up with a way to get an infectious disease to everyone, but still maintaining the same level of revenue for Gilead, because you still want them to invest in those things. So the challenge is not the profit maximizing model of 15 to 20% people, but 100% of the people getting these drugs.
Andy?
Well, just 2 quick points. I mean, in terms of you're asking what our level of optimism is. First of all, what we saw on the discovery development end of the continuum, the 21st Century Cures legislation, which was bipartisan, which really showed that we can, in fact, come together to address a challenge. As far as the delivery end of the spectrum, I think one of the most disruptive things in a positive way that's occurring is the influx of information technologies. Our ability to now acquire, aggregate, and analyze data with regard to what is actually happening in populations with regard to drugs and medical interventions, and then manage those populations in a more rational way. So we're getting the right treatment to the right person, getting the right outcome. That creates a completely different model of the Deming model of reducing variance around the mean, which improves quality and drives out cost by virtue of eliminating waste. And FDA modeled that some time ago, even looking at the use of a blood thinner, Coumadin. And if you could use a genetic test and be able to do that more, not perfectly, but improve the dosing, you get rid of underdosing with clots and strokes and overdosing with bleeding, and you reduce the net cost associated with the healthcare. So I'm optimistic because tools are emerging that are going to allow us to manage this system of healthcare delivery in a much more rational way.
Just before I go to the audience, I want to ask a question about the FDA. I don't know the current FDA commissioner, but Peggy Hamburg, when she was there, often appeared and talked to us. And you had the sense that there was this ongoing challenge to sort of do what you were doing when you were commissioner, which is to streamline, to modernize, that the system is old, that the laws that empowered the FDA and its purview were there. Our first run-in with Heather Bresch was not over EpiPen, was over her concern then that drugs that were made outside the United States were inspected and tested differently than those made inside the United States. And so led this charge to try to get more FDA inspectors and raise fees from industry to sort of help pay for that. And it was controversial with the FDA. The FDA did not like it at that time and came in. And you have this sense, and my apologies to everyone in the FDA, but it's out of ignorance, is that it was slightly creaky, that it had to be changed, had to be filtered, that some of the things that was... And so I just want to give you all just a short chance, if you were to change anything in the FDA and how it operated and interacted on these patient-based issues with industry, what would you shift and change beyond the 21st Century Cures Act? Andy, we're going to make you head of it.
Well, the most important issue is resources, and by that I just don't mean financial capital, I mean intellectual capital. The agency really needs the ability to be able to bring into the agency the kind of intellectual capital and talent that is really going to meet the kind of challenges you just described. And I think that's always been an important issue.
Do you think that's likely in this environment?
I think it's essential, and I think that there is enlightenment around that, but it has to be actualized. But for me, as an advocate for the FDA, and it is absolutely stunningly amazing, or institution made up of stunningly amazing people, we just need more of them, and they need to be supported and nurtured in a much more appropriate way, because they have the capacity to address these challenges and these problems.
Amy?
Yeah, I'll say ditto to that, and then 2 additional quick points. One is to your earlier question about is there interest in really attacking the whole problem. At Scott Gottlieb's confirmation hearing, whatever it was 2 weeks ago, I guess, Senator Sanders asked him about drug pricing, and he maybe it wasn't the appropriate place to talk about blowing up the whole thing, but his answer was very narrow, is that he would prioritize complex generics. And again, we've all agreed generics would help, but he didn't say Congress needs to look at this, and so I found that interesting.
He would prioritize in terms of pricing?
No, I'm sorry, in terms of speeding through the approval
I
of
see.
complex generics. And then the other issue, which again is far beyond drug pricing, that I would have FDA prioritize is the issue of communication on off-label. Going to Andy's point about data, if we have more real-world evidence that manufacturers gather and analyze, talking about what can happen, who can talk about that data and to whom. There were some recent guidances that came out, I won't go into detail about them, that are a small step in that direction, but they don't even talk about what providers can learn from manufacturers that's beyond what's on the label of the drug. FDA currently really limits the exchange of information for some really good reasons. But I think it's time for a new look at that. It's a new age.
That's where Jerry?
And I would agree with what all has been said, and just to add one more thing. 2 weeks ago, I was testifying in government operations, and Janet Woodcock was also testifying with me from the FDA. And what we were talking about are these limited distribution networks, and this is stuff that Martin Shkreli has taken advantage of. They essentially don't allow another generic drug company to get access to the drug in order to copy it, in order to provide tests for bioequivalence. And so essentially they maintain their monopoly in that way. And she said, and I can't do anything about that. And if I were to do one thing, give her one additional piece of authority, it would be to do something about the fact that there isn't an ability for them to make those drugs available when somebody like Martin Shkreli doesn't allow them to be copied.
Fascinating. Let me open up the floor to comments and questions. Thank all of you for a really great... Yes, in the very back?
My name's Sabai from the Association of Clinical Research Organizations. And I know all of you said that the FDA doesn't directly set prices, but the user fees are being reauthorized right now, and they contain real-world evidence using surrogate endpoint and patient experience data provisions. Do you think that'll affect prices? And my other add-on question to that is, our president wants to increase user fees that the manufacturers pay out. Do you think that'll affect drug prices?
So let me take the last question. I think it will, in fact, affect drug prices, mostly in the generic market, because if I'm a manufacturer of generic drugs and there's already 2 manufacturers in the generic market and it's very expensive for me to get FDA approval, I'm less likely to enter the market. So my concern is in the generic space. In the brand space, there is so much money to be made if you have a successful drug that an extra $1 million or $5 million doesn't matter. But in the generic space, it's very important.
Other questions?
Can I
comments?
just add
Yeah,
something
please,
to that?
Andy.
Well, one other thing that I think you'll see occur is we're moving much more to a horizontal understanding of the impact of these drugs on various disease states based on an underlying mechanism. And if the FDA can move to the point where it's approving based on mechanism of action rather than clinical indication, that changes the market structure for that particular drug. So there may be more patients that are able to access that. And that involves a change in label based on real-world evidence. And so what you see then is a different macroeconomics of they can lower price because they have more volume. And as Jerry was pointing out, we have to work with the industry to get those kinds of trade-offs right. If they just keep the price up here and have more volume, that doesn't help. There's got to be the ability to balance that.
Great. Other questions, comments? Let me just finish with one last one that I'm going to frame badly. I'm interested in this issue.
We won't answer it.
But hopefully you won't. But I mean, a lot of the things that you hear when you talk to folks in the drug industry and in the production side, the research side, is that there are flops out there. We've heard stories today about products and therapies and drugs that get near the end, get canceled, that the cost, the R&D side, Jerry, you were laying this out, are very high. And it reminds me in a weird way of the movie industry, where you're at Paramount Pictures and you may have a lot of Star Trek films, but not everything's going to, hit, or you're, that there are some blockbusters that come in, and certainly they kind of subsidize the flops or subsidize the things that don't go through. And But another way of not thinking of just flops if things don't go through are other needed diseases. Like in the rare disease arena, the R&D and return side for a lot of the therapies that are being developed in sort of the lesser known but important therapies. And I'm wondering whether there's some sort of quid pro quo that can be done there, where there's greater understanding when we hear about something like Gilead, but you know, there's greater investment in some of these other sidelines, which I know even our sponsor today and others are into, but don't get the attention, and whether that's a missing part of the discussion.
And I think it's a huge missing part of the discussion. And I think there are some drug companies that have done a very good job in going after certain orphan diseases and taking care of those, even though they sort of know that it's not going to be terribly.
And then pricing them in a responsible way that isn't.
Well, that has worked in the past and is not working so well now.
Mm-hmm.
So we were just talking, one of my colleagues at Johns Hopkins was talking about a drug that's exceedingly expensive, $450,000, $750,000, and we're just wondering, who can afford a drug that's $450,000 or $750,000? It's only for 6,000 kids, and so you need a very high price in order to invest in it. But who in society can afford $750,000 for
Amy,
this
any
drug?
thoughts?
I was just going to say that I think we've done some excellent things with law and regulation to promote innovation in areas of orphan disease, for example. But there's significant unmet medical need in this country in areas, diseases that are much larger. We heard about Alzheimer's this morning. I used to work in the field of Parkinson's. Significant unmet medical need in areas with diseases that are not orphan. And there are serious questions, a whole other session for another day, about whether our current system, which basically is neutral or agnostic on whether companies should prioritize one area or another, and whether as a country we should be prioritizing Alzheimer's, or should we be prioritizing R&D and innovation in areas
Like we are
that
cancer or something.
but even then, that's a lot of private go, no-go choices made by industry. And should we be pushing them a little harder the way they did with the orphan disease?
Final word, Andy?
I just come back to an earlier theme. I mean, there's a general sense that somehow or other there's an adversarial relationship between the FDA and industry. And frankly, there are some political forces who would prefer that it even be more adversarial. In fact, it really needs to be much more collaborative. The opportunity that the FDA has to work in a collaborative way with industry to get it right. And in getting it right, they, one, have a much higher probability of success, and two, they can fail early. And so they don't waste a lot of money taking drugs so far down the line only to find out that then they're not going to meet regulatory expectations and requirements. So what I would hope for is a change in culture and a larger political atmosphere of allowing a more collaborative relationship between the regulator and the industry to improve success. And in consequences of doing that, we ought to be able to reduce price.
And on that word, Andy, while you haven't left me with lots of hope, you've left me with just a little bit of hope on that. So let's give a big round of applause to Jerry Anderson, Amy Comstock, Rick, and Andrew von Eschenbach. Really great discussion. Thank you all very much. Thank you.